Brahma sohang sat chita anand re bai. Brahma sohang sat chita anand.
Yārī Madad, everybody, and a very warm welcome to all, and thank you for joining us on Ginan Insights. My name is Meera Mawani, and I'm an executive board member for Association for the Study of Ginans, and also lead this Ginan Insights webinar series, which was developed to examine different facets of Ginans in order to have a better understanding of this unique literature. His Highness the Aga Khan has at various times called it a wonderful tradition and emphasized the importance of preserving this remarkable heritage. We conduct these webinars a few times a year, and through them, we hope to develop a conversation about past and current areas of research in Ginans so that this extraordinary poetic legacy generates greater awareness and space for sharing knowledge and inspire people to study and research this magnificent tradition of Ginans. It gives me great pleasure to introduce a very special guest, Alif Pyarali Keshwani, to you. As an IAS graduate of the first Wise in and Teacher Education Program, Mr. Keshwani received a certificate in Advanced Islamic Studies from the IIS and a postgraduate diploma in education from London University. He served professionally at ITRAB India for 17 years in various capacities as an Alwise department head of higher secondary curriculum and a chief executive officer. He was a member of the co-curriculum committee at the IIS that developed various modules for the IWTP and PTEP vectors under the guidance of Dr. Aziz Ismail. He developed a module on literature called Traditions of Muslim Devotional Poetry, which included an extensive study of Ginans, Qasidas, and other genres of Muslim poetry in several languages. He also taught this module at the IWTP and PTEP programs in London and Dubai for several years. Thereafter, he studied for a master's in Indo-Muslim culture at Harvard University. He served as research consultant for the IIS for a few years, conducting ethnographic research on the rites and rituals of various Muslim communities of South Asian origin, such as the Satpant Khoja Ismailis, Imam Shahis, some of the Bora communities, Ithna Asharis, Sunnis, and Sufis. He has translated several of the IIS publications into Gujarati. One of the examples is Early Shia Thought by Dr. Arzina Lalani, which is co-translated by Dilshad Keshwani, happens to be his wife, and also an IWTP graduate from the IIS. In addition, he has, Mr. Alif Pyarali Keshwani has also translated 6 of the secondary curriculum modules, 2 volumes each of the Muslim Societies and Civilizations, Faith and Practice, Quran and its interpretations. As an honorary Alwise and an educator, he has delivered Wises in India, the USA, and Africa. Alwise Keshwani, a very warm welcome to you. Before I hand over to the Alwise, a few observations, if I may. Although there has been progress in the study of Ginanic literature over the past several decades, a detailed critical study of many Ginans and granths have yet to be undertaken. Granths form an important part of our Ginanic literature, and the Association for Study of Ginans is committed to bringing you more such critically researched works on granths. Talking particularly about the study on Ginans and granths, last year we had Alwise Ashraf Ladha on our Ginan Insights platform, who talked about his in-depth critical study on Saloko Nano. Before that, we had Professor Tazim Qasim talk about Garbis and her groundbreaking book, Songs of Wisdom and Circles of Dance, Hymns of the Muslim Saint Pir Shams. Today's talk is on yet another granth called Si Harfi, meaning 30 letters of the alphabet, attributed to Sayyid Aḥmed Shāh. In this first of its kind critical study, Alif Pyarali Keshwani will examine the literary, social, and spiritual significance of this mystical treatise. There will be 2 parts to this talk on Si Harfi. Today's talk will cover part 1. which will explore the form of this poetic genre of Si Harfi and why this is a popular verse form in various religious traditions in the Indian subcontinent. Secondly, there will be a comparison made between Si Harfi and another similar text called Alif Nāmā, which was discovered by Alif Pyarali Keshwani while researching in a library. And finally, he will investigate questions about authorship of Si Harfi in light of this revelation. Part 2 of this talk will be held next month after mid-May, where Alvise will examine the themes and concepts of Si Harfi in depth. Coming back to today's session, Alvise Pyarali Keshwani, it is an honor to have you with us today, and we are excited to hear about your critical study on Si Harfi. And I'd like to hand it over to you now.
So, shukran lillah, alhamdulillah. It's a great honor and privilege to be addressing this august assembly of seekers of knowledge, marifa. Now, I have so many people to thank really for this. In particular, I thank ASG and all of you present today to join me in the journey that started quite many years ago. I would start with acknowledging the support and inspiration and encouragement of so many individuals and institutions. Basically, this work had started as part of my program at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in 1983. That was the first Wise-in teacher training program. And in that, we were supposed to write a dissertation. My interest was always on Ginans, and I chose this particular Ginan. Why did I choose this? One is that, of course, its content, its rag, but more so, also because it has Arabic alphabets, and that is the only specimen in our Ginan corpus so far known. And I was fascinated with those questions, that why Arabic alphabets are used. And I thought that was the only Ginan or only specimen, not only in our Ginans, but in the world. So I started with that, exploring that as part of my dissertation. Then working with Institute of Ismaili Studies and at the ITREB for India and several other ITREBs that I was associated with, this work grew in my knowledge, in my understanding, and I'll share part of the journey too. Now, it's really fascinating that this text is so in-depth and such a powerfully mystical poetry that every time you return to it and listen to it, you feel something deeper about it. And I will share some of the aspects about that also. So why study the Si Harfi? As it was said, that today's session is actually not so much about on the content of the Si Harfi that we'll explore in the next session, but just some basic ideas which also prompted my journey and also continues to encourage me, that this is such a powerfully mystical, inspiring poetry or Ginan or granth, a short granth though. Its appeal, its rag, its meaning, it's highly inspiring. It shows really the path of meditation, the spiritual pursuit that we engage in. So how one enters into the pursuit of meditation, and what one has to do as preparation and what one has to do as a procedure. So there are preparatory and procedural aspects of it. There is also importance of Sadguru, the Isme Azam, the word or Naam that is bestowed upon the seeker, the ethic that one has to follow, and the whole science of really meditation and ultimately reaching to supreme bliss, Ananda. In fact, Si Harfi says that once the Guru Krupa hui Nij Sampurna, when the grace of the Lord or grace of the Master completes or culminates, tab khalak doe ek hi spurana, then the creator and the created both are of one origin. So one rises to that level, and there are several intriguing terminologies used that you experience that dekhe dikhave sohang brahm. So the person who engages into meditation at the climax of his spiritual attainment, he would become one with the master or one with the ultimate, So much so that Guru Chela na Raya Koi. Now there is no distinction between Guru and Chela. All that distinctions are vanished. And so he Raya Jasu Srasti Hoi. Only that remains who actually sustains the world. Dekhe dikhave sohang Brahm. So he sees and he is also manifesting that I am Brahman. Aham Brahmasmi. Soham Brahm. Soham is that I am Brahman. Now it echoes the sentiment that Mansur al-Hallaj had proclaimed, an al-Haq. So that's the journey, that the destination of it, or the ultimate results of it. The text is very powerful in the sense that it integrates a lot of Sufi terminology, Bhakti terminology, Jnana Marg, yogic concepts. So all this will, inshallah, explore in the next session. But today's session, we are going to talk more about the author and the text. So it's basically going to be a little academic, and I urge you to bear with me. But there's a lot to learn, and quite fascinating aspects. So we'll plunge into that. So basically, there are 4 parts to this presentation. We'll cover 3. The first part will be the form of poetry, where we discuss what is it and where this originated and why this whole purpose of this particular form of composition, what must be the reason behind that. Then we'll compare Si Harfi with a very similar text that I found during the course of my research much later, after I graduating from the IIS. And then that raised a lot of questions about authorship. So we'll try to deal with understanding the question of authorship from a literary criticism perspective. And the next session will plunge into actually the text and dig out some of the themes from it. So these are the 2 pictures to show, the one in Khojki, another in Gujarati. So this compilation includes some Ginans like Satwarni, and Satwarni in larger volume and the shorter version. And it also includes Si Harfi, and this is the Lalji Devraj's publication of 1959. I also, along with that, compared it with several manuscripts, not several really. In fact, I could have only 3 to 4 manuscripts in Khojki of particularly the Si Harfi, but had to look through several manuscripts to find those. And in this process, the catalog prepared by Zawai Nurali Moer was very helpful. And I must say that along this journey, I've looked at the works of so many teachers and mentors who have really helped me in understanding this process. Some of them like Wazir Parmanand Khodidas and Wazir Chotubhai Lakhani, and so many scholars and mentors at IIS. Really, there are too many to name. I don't want to take time on that. And also, I'm afraid that I might miss somebody. But they have all really contributed to my understanding. A lot of students with whom I studied, they have really shared their insights, and that has enriched my understanding. So first part, form of poetry, what is it? So basically, Si Harfi, Si means, it's a Persian word. Si means 30. Harf is a letter. Sarfi, Si Harfi is 30 letters. So what happens, there are alliteration of words. So every line of the poem is basically structured in a way that it uses Arabic alphabet, or it could be any other language, as we will see the alphabets of other languages. So the one particularly that we are studying uses Arabic alphabets. Although the title is Farsi, Si Harfi, the letters usually that are used are Arabic. So for example, the first letter is Alif. So the first line would be Alif Allah Ek Avinashi Dev. So A, there's alliteration. There's also now alliteration of second word, Allah Ek. There could be works where more than 2 words or the whole line is alliteration. So Alif Allah Ek Avinashi Dev. Now the next letter is Be. So Bin Jibia Samaran. Now, first we heard about what is Allah, the description of Allah, that is Avinashi is indestructible. Be Bin Jibia means without moving your tongue. Samaran is basically remembrance, or in Islamic Sufi context, or Ismaili context, we call it zikr. So how do you have to engage in zikr? It says bin jibya, without moving your tongue. So that's basically, there are two types of zikr, zikr jali and zikr khafi, popularly known. There are some other types also, but bin jibya is zikr khafi, that you don't utter that word loud. It's a silent invocation. Be bin jibya, so ba, that's the alliteration here. Then te, tit vasat sahaj kar lije. Te, tit, ta. So vasat is basically a thing. Here it refers to the Guru Mantra or Ismi Azam, or the mystical syllable that is bestowed upon the seeker by the master. So tit vasat. So now make that thing, make that word, or make that Ismi Azam sahaj, natural to yourself. You make it so natural. Bhajan karta vilam na kijiye. Don't procrastinate in engaging into devotion. So tit vasat sahaj kar lijiye by practice. Now we are going to discuss, as I said, the theme part in the next session, so I'll not go here. But here it's important to know that this is the usage of alphabets, and based on alphabets, the first word of that line are chosen. So there are 28 Arabic letters, and generally 2 are added, Lam, Alif, and Hamza, to make it 30, and that's how it becomes Si Harfi, 30 letters. Now, this type of arrangement where alphabets are used sequentially, it's called Abecedarian type of poetry. There are some Sufis who have used this arrangement of alphabets in reverse order, like Miranji Shamshul Shak, a Dakhni Sufi poet. He starts his Si Harfi with Ya. Mind you, I was not aware of other Si Harfis other than what we see in Ginans, and I thought that was my mistake. I thought that's the only specimen, but then I realized that this is actually a genre, and it's there in so many cultures and for so many different uses. So this Sufi, he uses his Si Harfi in a reverse order, starting with Ya and going to ending with Alif. Now, of course, poets have their own reasons why they do what they do, but definitely it draws some attention. It is apart from the ordinary. So it's a very powerful, mystical poem. Then I found some examples in Swahili literature also, and Waji, but J is not pronounced, I believe, in Swahili. So Wai. It's a mystical work by Sayyid Omar, and in that he has a acrostic poem, but he uses not only alif, be, te, like in sequence the letter, but he uses the declensions. So we have a, u, and I, e, that is fatha, dhamma, kasra. So he has poem on all 3 declensions. So that requires a lot of skill on the part of the poet. If the poem, the arrangement of letter, it forms a word. Now, in Si Harfi of Ahmed Shah that we are studying now, it has just a sequential order. There's no word formation. But if it results into a word, then it's true acrostic. And a poet may want to convey a particular formula or a sentence or a message, then he uses true acrostic. So it doesn't follow the alphabetical order. There are multiple ways of organizing letters, really. So some arrange the first letter of the poem vertically, and that becomes a sentence, or that doesn't become a sentence. That's Ali Bete or depending on the language that is used there. Or sometimes they use the last letter, or sometimes they use both. So it's calling for skill on the part of the poet. So, and then when you read those letters vertically, then sometimes they form word. Like, say, for example, we have one poem in Indic literature, and if you read the first lines of the poem, then it results into Sri Ram, Jai Ram, Jai Jai Ram. So the poem is following that word order, but then even if you read those words in vertical order, there's a word, there's a sentence formed. There are some who actually arrange it in a way that the last letters, if you read in sequentially vertically, then it would give a sentence. So there's multiple ways of doing it. There are some poems, acrostic poems, which are diagonal diagonally organized. No, like it's more or less like a crossword puzzle in Indic languages, and it became really, it was a very popular genre. Now we find examples in Farsi, Pashto, Punjabi, Sindhi, Urdu. All these languages, we have these acrostic poems. Now these languages have more than 30 letters. Yet the poets sometimes use the title Si Harfi, meaning 30 letters. So this title, the genre was that popular. Sometimes these are named based on the number of letters. Say, for example, in Gujarati, Hindi, in Sanskrit, or other Indic languages, they call it Bavan Akhri because there are 52 letters putting consonants and vowels together. Or sometimes they use only consonants, which are 34, so they call it Chautisa. Or it is also known as Kakahara, that is letter K to Ha. So it's the whole range of complete ABCD. Or another name for Si Harfi is Alif Nama. So it's a generic name. Instead of giving how many letters one is using, it is starting from Alif and so on. So it's called Alif Nama. And we find examples in Indic languages, also in Farsi. Now let's talk about where this form originated. Lajvanti Ramakrishna, who has studied Punjabi Sufi poets, it's a very interesting work, and a lot of Sufi poems are included. Even the Guru Granth Sahib is discussed, and some acrostic poems are found in Guru Granth Sahib. So considering all that, Lajvanti concludes that this is a Punjabi form. Now, of course, a lot of examples we find in Punjabi, but as I said, this is not just restricted there. We have so many earlier examples going back to before Christ. So in Old Testament, Hebrew, in French literature, in English literature, Chaucer, his poet. So these acrostic poems are everywhere. In Arabic, we have abjad, that is alif, be, jim, dal. So that's the pattern that is used. And we have some examples in Arabic literature. In Persian literature, especially that was written in India, there's one very interesting poem referred to by Professor Anne-Marie Schimmel. She quotes Qasim Kahi's Alif Nāmā, a very beautiful poetry in Farsi, and it uses Farsi letters. And the title given is Alif Nama. It's basically in the praise of Hazrat Ali, and it integrates very interesting anecdotes about Hazrat Ali's life, which maybe we'll discuss some other time. As I said, in India, we have Sanskrit, Tamil, Marathi, Bengali, Punjabi, Sindhi, Assamese, Urdu, Gujarati, etc. So acrostic poems are everywhere. Now, why poet would employ this? What are the reasons? There's one author, Ghosh, he has studied Bengali literature, and he says these are basically play of words and bag of tricks. Well, that it might be, but there are more serious reasons, and let's look at some of those. One is it's used as a pedagogy, as a mnemonic or a memory device. Just as when we want to learn ABCD, we learn A for apple, B for boy, C for cat. Now we don't have anything to do specifically with apple, cat, and dog, but the idea is we associate that alphabet with some object so that it registers. So it helps memorizing. So in Sufi and religious context, the poets use this acrostic to convey their message, the Sufi message, or the devotional message, or spiritual message, or the Quranic terms. And we'll see in this Si Harfi that we'll examine that a lot of words they are used specifically to convey Asmaul Husna, the beautiful names of Allah, or Prophet's names. So Mim would be used for Muhammad, Khe would be used for Khawind or Khuda or Khudi. So different religious concepts are conveyed or taught through using the acrostic design. We'll look at specific examples in Si Harfi as we go along. One very important reason behind using this is the letter symbolism, the power that words carry. And Professor Anne-Marie Schimmel calls it golden alphabet. Now, this is based on the science, what is known as in Islam, ilm al-huruf, the science of letters. One author, Al-Buni, which Professor Schimmel includes in her book, Mystical Dimension, and there's a special section on letter symbolism. She quotes Al-Buni. He says, it must not be imagined that the secret of letters can be discovered with the aid of logical reasoning. So words have these letters have power, and logical reasoning is not sufficient to grasp that. Like in the Quran, we have huruf muqta'at, and that also there are several, there are mystery letters in the Quran. So Al-Buni says it cannot be imagined that the secret of letters can be discovered with the aid of logical reasoning. It can be reached only through vision and the aid of divine intervention. So there's a lot at play when we are dealing with this type of poem. It's not really only a mere bag of tricks as it appears apparently to some, but there are deeper reasons. Like for example, in the Si Harfi that we are studying, Sayyid Aḥmed Shāh, he says, focus on all the letters. 300 akshar kandha. No, pay heed to all the 30 letters and hear that. और अक्षर शब्द होए हृदय पीयू को नाम लिख 300 अक्षर का अंदर यही बड़ो उपदेश. The starting only this verse comes that you pay heed to all 30 letters, and this is the biggest of admonitions. So letters embody a big message. In further on in Si Harfi, Ahmed Shah says, हृदय पीयू को नाम लिख और अक्षर शब्द होए Piyu piyu karanta honi hoi so hoi. So inscribe the name of your beloved onto your heart. Or akshar sabdo, and then leave all the other letters aside. Because the letters have value, significance, insofar they result in the name of the beloved. That has to be inscribed on your heart. That you have to engage with that, you have to log into that, connect to that. And that really gives the whole meaning to your life. I'm reminded of a story in Bhagavad Purana context. It is narrated, it's a mythical story perhaps, that gopis, of course, are known to love Krishna so much. And Narad Muni comes to gopis, and he wanted to educate gopis into the science of Vedanta. And it's a mythical story, I believe. They were approached and asked that this is a rich scripture, you have to learn it. So the gopis say, does it have the name of my Krishna? Does it have the name of my beloved? Of course, Vedanta doesn't have. So the gopis said, then we don't have anything to do with it. So Hriday Piyu ko naam likh aur akshar sabd hoy. So letter symbolism is something very, very powerful, that it connects to your beloved, it connects to your master, and master can mean several things. The beloved is the guru, or it's the ultimate reality. Another mystical indication of this type of literature is use of nukta or om. Now, both are very powerful mystical syllables or mystical letters. Nukta is dot, or om is a mystical syllable. A lot of Upanishads begin with that. Nukta, we know that nukta is a dot, and anything you start to write, you would begin with nukta. So basically, it's a symbol of creation. So some poets, some Sufi poets, they begin their Si Harfi or acrostic poems with a letter, additional letter called nukta. Before even going to alif, they will put a line with nukta. Or this Si Harfi that we are going to discuss, we are discussing, is starting with it has this line in the beginning, Om or Ohankar. Nukta is a symbol of Isme Azam, or the Guru Mantra, or the mystical word that Master gives. We hear in Kalam-e-Maula, Ek Nukta Marfat Kera, jisko koi na pahunche amal, that this Nukta of Marifa, the gnosis, is such that nothing can compare. Jisko koi na pahunche amal, no act of faith is equal to that nukta. एक नुक्ता मार्फत के राह जिसको मुर्शिद जिसे दिखलावे, वासल होवे जात हक में असल अपने को पावे. So if you connect with that nukta or the isme azam or the word or the name given by master, nothing can reach that amal. It's the highest of them. We have this terminology kare buzurg, that is the work that is buzurg or very serious, or botu kam, the highest engagement. So these are the words connoted through use of nukta and om. There's also a liturgical significance. One Sufi, Yār, Muhammad Yār, writes Si Harfi. He calls it Si Harfi Maqbul Rasul, and says if you read this Si Harfi often, then it will fulfill all your desires. So there's a liturgical purpose also. Of course, Si Harfis have some social usage also, and for commemoration or praising deities, invocations of prophets or deities, but also some would write Si Harfis, the whole poem on acrostic, to praise the bride and the bridegroom. So it has a social usage also. It's used in some novels also, like Girti Diware. With popularization of this genre, it was used for writing, addressing social issues, political issues, like imposition of water tax, praise of Mahatma Gandhi during British time, railways, opposition to British rule or world war. And there are many socio-political issues that are addressed through this genre of literature. Now let's come to comparing Si Harfi and Alif Nāmā that Meera mentioned. Now, this is a fascinating discovery story. After graduating from the IIS, I had several occasions to get to present this in not only in India but also at the IIS, and IIS encouraged me to do some further research on it. So as I was working on Si Harfi, looking at the contemporary yogic and bhakti poetry, I came across one book in Hyderabad, and it quoted one verse, Re Ravat hoy pure asan, prem hoy to bethe sihasan. And I really it struck me that, my goodness, this is the verse that I read it in Si Harfi. Now, who is this by? And in footnote, it was given Yārī Sahib ki Ratnavali. Now, I didn't know who Yārī is and what is Ratnavali. I had not come across so far. And then I started looking for this Yārī Sahib ki Ratnavali. Went through so many libraries, and everywhere I went, I would look for Ratnavali or Yārī. Those days, I remember, there were no computers. You go through the cards and Ratnavali, then I realized it's a generic title in Sanskrit, in Hindi, and Gujarati. So many titles are called Ratnavali, but there was none of Yārī. And I wanted to find out that where this verse comes from, which poem is it. I was working in Bombay and traveled between Hyderabad and Bombay, and was new to Bombay. But I went to Iranian Culture House Library, looking for some Persian literature to see if there are Si Harfis there. And, you know, I'm basically reminded that is a hadith or if the call attributed to Hazrat Ali, that when you seek something very intensely, God directs your feet to the source of that knowledge. And something similar happened. I was in Iranian Culture House and I inquired about this is the title I'm looking for. They said, you might find something in Mahatma Gandhi Library. I said, where is it? I was new to Bombay. They said, it's just a few minutes away from here. So I went to that library, and it was a closed access library. Sure enough, I went to catalog a lot of cards of Ratnavali. It was a closed access library, so you have to request for 3 or 4 books at a time. And I called for second, third, fourth lot, and looking at various Ratnavali. And in one of the work, I found Yārī Sahib ki Ratnavali, the one which I was looking for months. And when I started reading it, and I felt as if I'm reading Si Harfi by Ahmed Shah. And we'll now compare these two. I'm not a scientist, but I could literally feel what Archimedes may have felt when he said Eureka, when he discovered the solution to the problem that he was looking for. And I immediately wanted to share this with somebody. So I spoke to the librarian. I said, "You have done really great help to me today." I said, "What happened?" And I just discussed this whole what this discovery means to me. But it also amazed me that now who is the author? Is Yārī Sahib is the author, or Ahmed Shah that is there in the author? Now, what are the minute differences and similarities? So if you look at the two texts and the author's comparison, Ahmed Shah, the Ginanic corpus has this Si Harfi, which is attributed to Ahmed Shah. In the Ginan, we find only name Ahmed. There is no Sayyid written, just like in other Ginans we have Bane Pir Sadruddin, Bane Pir Hassan Kabiruddin, or Bolya Sayyid Imam Shah, Sayyid Imam Begum. So there is some indication of whether the composer was a Pir or Sayyid. In this, it's an exception. There is no indication of Sayyid or Pir. Then Ahmed Shah seemed to have lived in 16th century, 16th, 17th century. And if you look at Yāris, there's not much information available on Yārī either. Just as on Ahmed Shah, we don't have any information, or besides that name, Ahmed, the poem doesn't give any clue. Now, who was Ahmed Shah? We'll look at the genealogy and try to figure out. But Yārī, he is supposed to be a saint of a Bawri branch, and he lived around 17th, 18th century. Now, mind you, these dates are tentative as they are given in the sources, printed sources. But one can't be fully sure whether these dates are what, because the authors themselves or editors, they say this is what is generally known. Now, if you look at the placement of Ahmed Shah according to the tradition, then we know some famous Pirs like Pir Sadruddin, and then comes Pir Hassan Kabiruddin. And after Pir Hassan Kabiruddin, until then, the Piratan was quite hereditary. And Hassan Kabiruddin had 18 sons. Al Hamari Jugmai Jano ne Adhar Farzan Puradi. Tene tame Amara Kari Jano, પણ ન સેવો સદગુર જાણી. So there's some indication by Pir Hassan Kabiruddin himself in Khado, another Khado, where he alludes to some situation there, that I have 18 children, you consider them as all of them as mine. તેને તમે અમારા કરી જાણો, પણ ન જાણો સદગુરુ જાણી. So don't consider them as Pir. So there must have been some issue that who is going to be the next Pir. And as indicated in the Anathakado, after Pir Hassan Kabiruddin, the Piratan didn't go hereditary in the line, but it was given to Pir Tajuddin, the brother. And Sayyid Imam Shah, the history says, or some narrations say that he was not happy with it. And some sources say that he separated from the Dawat or the Nizari Panth, and he started his own Imam Shahi sect, which is there in Gujarat, Pirana. Some would say that no, it was not Imam Shah, and we find evidences in the Ginan that he remained faithful. In fact, there's a story of him visiting the Imam, the whole text of Jannat Puri, but that's a different topic. But we recite this Ginan, Shah Nakhatavya Vira Jampudip Mahe. So that's an indication of Imam Shah being invited by the Imam, and then he takes that journey. His son was Nur Muhammad Shah. So there is also a version that Nur Muhammad Shah, it was not Imam Shah who succeeded, but it was Nur Muhammad Shah, his son. But he took the name of Imam Shah and established the sect Imam Shah. Modern research, especially by Dr. Shafiq Virani, he actually establishes and contradicts the earlier scholarship who either said Imam Shah succeeded or Nur Muhammad Shah succeeded. And he establishes that no, none of them really left the tariqah. But Nur Muhammad Shah's son was Sayyid Aḥmed Shāh. That is the name that appears. And this Si Harfi is attributed to Ahmed Shah. Now, it's very interesting that if this work belongs to the Sayyids of Imam Shahi line, we don't find this work in the vast devotional literature that is published by Imam Shahis. Si Harfi is not there. Other Ginans are there. Many of the Ginans, I should say, are there. And most of them invariably now attributed to Imam Shah, but Si Harfi is not there. So that raises some question. Where do we place Sayyid Aḥmed Shāh? Is he in the same line, or was he connected with the Imam Shahi group? But anyway, this is the line of the Sayyids. In Si Harfi, we have 8 parts, and in all parts except the first, Ahmad occurs. And as I said, there's no indication whether he was a Pir or Sayyid. Coming to Yārī, Yārī appears as a name or as a word. Yārī means also a name or a friendship. Yārī Hari Sukiji or Yārī Ali Ji Suki. So is it a name or a name of a person, or is it an abstract noun? That's a question. Now, Alif Nama, this Yārī Sahib ki Ratnavali has 2 versions of Alif Nama. One is a longer one and there is a shorter one. There are beautiful other poems also, but we are focusing on the acrostic poetry now. Now, in longer version, he uses Yārī as Ya, on Ya, but in shorter version, he uses 2 Yas. One is Choti Ya and another is Badi Ya. So for Choti Ya, from Choti Ya, that letter, the word formed is Yārī, and on Badi Ya is Yar. So if the indication is that the last, the name that appears on the last line is usually the nom de plume, the pen name of the poet, is suggestive of the composer, then was his name Yārī or was it Yar? Because we do find Yar also, as I said, Muhammad Yar is one of the poets. So it's an open question really. Further, the verses in Si Harfi are, as I said, 8, and they are arranged in sections or parts. And there is one refrain. So there will be 4 stanza, and then there is a Varani. Re tuhi, Mara, Sacha, Saiya, Piyuji tuhi. Now this is a very common refrain in Ginans. It may be there in other Bhakti poems, but this is very prominent in the Ginan tradition. We have it in Bhuj Niranjan, we have it in Chandrabhan, Surbhan, Satveni, Nani, Moti, Manhar, so many Ginans, granths rather, would have that refrain. So this Si Harfi has that refrain. The first and the last part are unique in the sense they are not there in Alif Nāmā, I found in Yāri's Ratnavali. So if you take Si Harfi of Ahmed Shah, it has a first part and the last part which are unique there, which are not included in Yāri's Ratnavali. So how is Yāri's Ratnavali arranged? It is a continuous poem. There's no refrain in between, and there are 32 couplets or dohas, and no name, no first part and the last part that we find in. They're very rich because the first part is basically on cosmology, and it reflects the Shi dimension of Panchtan Pak, and so that gives the identity that it's a Shia text. Also talks about the Sadguru. All that inshallah we'll discuss in the next session. And refrain is not there. Retuhi doesn't come in Yāri's Ratnavali. Language is simplified in Ahmed Shah Si Harfi. And this is another question that who wrote first and who simplified it, and why, how did it get simplified? These are some of the issues we'll discuss a little later. If you look at the language of Yārī, it's although understandable Hindi written in Devanagari script, but comparatively it is quite archaic, and we'll see some samples here. Okay, now let's do the comparison of 2 texts. On one side, I have Si Harfi by Ahmed Shah, and the other side is this Alif Nama, it's called, of Yārī, attributed to Yārī. So I've used two colors. Red means they are unique, they are separate, they are different, and greens are more or less similar, although words are not exactly the same. But as we will read, say for example, the end doha of Si Harfi, the first part, of course, as I said, is not there at all in Yāri's Ratnavali. So the doha at the end of first part is Onkar apar bhaj ane taj abhiman kalesh re 300 akshar kandar ehi bado updesh re. So Onkar is a mystical syllable. Apar means immensely. Bhaj, devote or repeat. Taj abhiman kalesh re. So forsake, leave abhiman, pride. Kalesh is discord. 300 akshar kandar ehi bado updesh. So pay heed to all 30 letters, and this is the biggest of admonitions. Now what Yārī has to say, Omkar ke par bhaju. It's a very similar idea that you repeat that Omkar, apar, ke par bhaju, means incessantly. Taji abhiman kalesh re. So taji means forsaking, abhiman and kalesh. Tiso achar prem ke. Now there it was Tiso achar kandar. So pay heed, listen to all 30 letters. Whereas here it says this all 30 letters prem ke, these are the letters of love. Ehi bad updesh le. This is the biggest one. So there is very message is pretty similar. The language is at least to modern usage, it appears to be quite simplified when compared to Yārī. Let's look at the second part. You'll see a lot of green and red. As I said, green is quite similar and reds are the reds. Okay, Alif. You see in blue, the Alif, Be, Te, Se, Jim. That's the order. The same order is followed in Ratnavali, Alif Nama. Alif, Ek, Alif, Be, Te, Se, Jim. Now, Aḥmed Shāh says, Alif ek avinashi dev, apagat aparam apar abhev, ta jiv tu dhar dhyan hazur, sohi sab thor raha bharpur. Now, we'll not go too much into translation of it, which in any case we are going to read in the next session. But the whole idea is that Avinashi, that indestructible deity or Brahman, is indestructible, is infinite, abhay, mysterious. Tajiv dhartu dhyan hazur. So focus your attention on that, because he is present, he is omnipresent. So he sabtor raha bharpur, he is fully present everywhere. So it's basically pointing to the attribute of Brahman, absolute reality, or in Islamic, in the Quranic term, Allah. Ek avinashi dev avigat aparampar hi abhev tahi dharo dhari dhyan hazur. So sab thor means places, raha bharpur, that he is present everywhere. Bharpur is fully present. No? Be bin jivya smaran karo, mansule unki dhunaj dharo, puran brahma jaha taha aap te ajampa ka kije ja. So again, describing the absolute reality, that now you engage in that remembrance, bin jivya, without uttering, moving your tongue. Mansule, take it to your mind, and you engross in it. Dhunaj dharo, puran brahma. Now Brahman, and now there's a puran brahma, absolute Brahman. Now basically they're trying to emphasize Brahman itself means absolute reality, but Puran means complete or perfect. Absolute Brahman, jaha taha aap, is everywhere. Te ajampa ka kije jap. So the Isme Azam or the Guru mantra that you use for meditation or dhyan is actually Puran Brahma. Te ajampa ka kije jap. So we'll dwell more on what is the concept of ajapa. This Yārī says, Be bin jivya sumiran kare, unminiso man ki dhuni dhare, Puran Brahma jahata aap tahi jap ke kije jap. Te, on te, Aḥmed Shāh says, Tit vasat sahaj kar lije, bhajan karta vilam na kije, jo tan man maahe surat lagave, alak niranjan ghat mein paave. So, Tit vasat sahaj kar lije, make that natural to yourself. Aḥmed Shāh, this Yārī says, Te tat sodhi ke lije. So you have to search for that tat, meaning that word. Here it was, you have to make that word natural to yourself. Here Yārī says you have to search for it, be in quest. Sodhi ke lijiye, mathan karta soch na kijiye. Now, don't think too much in engaging in mathan. Mathan is like contemplation, chintan mathan, right? Whereas there it was, don't procrastinate, don't do vilam. I'll go a little faster, but reds show a lot of differences. This is interesting. Hey had mein had ki rail. There are two realms that are alluded. Had is limited and behad is limitless. Hey had mein had ki rail. So if you engage in the limited realm, then there is limited. But if you want to have liberation, behad mahe mukti ka khel. The play of mukti, the liberation, is in the realm of behad. Now, just as we have alim Halk, that is the created world, and alim amra, that is the spiritual world. So if you want to be in the, if you get into the play of liberation of your soul, then you have to worry, you have to think about not had, but get into the behad. And this Yārī says, Hai had mein kyun karo rail? So why are you stuck in the limited role? Ahmed Shah is stating the statement as a fact that had mein had ki rail, whereas Yārī said, why are you stuck in the realm of had? Although concept of had and behad both are dealing with, but in different words. Khe khalak se, whereas Yārī says khe khawand ko. So both referring to Allah, the supreme or the ultimate reality. Dwar das khojle, daso dis khojo hota hai. So what I'm basically trying to show, there's a lot of similarity, and there are starting differences also. Re rawat hoy pure hasan. How can we miss out this line? Because it was this line that actually paved my journey further. Re rawat hoy pure hasan, prem hoy to bethe si hasan. Rawat is brave or courageous, perfect or expert. Pure asana, if you are expert in asanas, that is the yogic part of yogic discipline, prem hoy to bethe si hasan. So even if you are very expert in all the asanas, what is important more than asana is prem, love. Prem hoy to bethe si hasan. So you will reach the throne of your pursuit if you have love. Whereas Yārī says Ravan hoy pure asan. So he's taking the example of Ravan. So Ravan and Rawat sound very similar, but the metaphors that are used here is Ravan. Ravan hoy pure asan. Ravana is known to be a spiritualist and had a lot of accomplishment and spiritual attainment to his credit. Of course, we remember him as in a different light, but he is also known to have had a spiritual journey. So Ravan hoy pure asan, bethe prem tat sihasan. So again, the prem part, the tat part, or the sihasan similar symbols are there, but the comparison is Ravan, and then he says Sahaj hi Lanka gat tode. In Ahmed Shah it is said Banka gat tode. Banka is cricket or difficult. So if you have love, then you are able to surmount that gad, meaning fort of meditation or that spiritual journey, if there is love. Here also there is element of love, but with Ravan, Lanka goes quite handy. We'll not take too many examples now. Inat Shah ki fire, inat Hari ki bade. Then Gani ka kije dhyan. So Yārī says from Gain, Gussa taji ke dhare dhyan. So Gani is the name of one of the Asmaul Husna, Al-Ghani, and here it is Gain, Gussa. So that is anger. Faham, Farman and Faham on Fe. Now we can go on comparison, but let's take some derivations. What do we learn from this? There are similarities and there are differences. Now, who would have written first? If you go chronologically, then of course Ahmed Shah seems to be prior to Yārī. So one would say that he wrote first and Yārī adopted it, but we can't be 100% sure, right? So In Ahmed Shah, the two first and last definitely are a new thing. They are there. So either they were added or they were removed. In between, there are verses. Then there's also this Re Tuhi that comes in, and there's a Doha that follows, and there's a lot of similarity. Now, it's really not easy to establish the issue of authorship, but can we look at this similarity and differences? One would say that no, this is a plagiary. Somebody has really uh, done some stealing here. But what does literary criticism tell us or help us to understand this issue of authorship better? Literary criticism is a vast field. When we deal with a text, there are actually three components. One is author, then there's text, and then there's a reader. Now, all three, we have to ask the question, who is more important? Is author important, or text important, or reader important? Of course, one would say author is important because it is the author who started the process. He wrote it, and therefore you have a text, and then you are now reading it. So author is very, very supreme, understandable, because that text, we'll get the understanding of that text better if you know the author, know the culture and time of the author. So authors are always given primacy. But is that always the case? Many a times what happens, author may not be always around, and sometimes the author of the text may not be known. Let's say, for example, Vedas, Upanishads, and many supreme texts of the world, authors are not known, but the text have profound impact. It continues to be. So author, while author is important, it plays a central role, and especially if the author is known and author has a reputation, then it carries ready sort of impression. No, I am reminded of a joke that some person went to a Sufi, went to a Shaira, and he read his poem. Now, of course, that audience may not have been that knowledgeable about that literature, but he read a poem and said, Ghalib ne kya khub kaha hai. Well, no, Ghalib has said so beautifully. And then as he finished the poetry, people said, wah, 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 wah. No, that Ghalib is a very big name. So anything that goes in Ghalib's name has ready appeal. So as people gave him applause, he said, Mazarat चाहता हूँ मैं beg your pardon, असल में ये मिसरा तो मैंने खुद ने लिखा है, ये गालिब का नहीं है. Now, immediately the attention would shift. So author really tends to be naturally having a lot of impact when we deal with the text. But Ronald Barthes wrote a work with author is dead. Author is actually not alive, is not around. So who is the author now? So reader also becomes a co-author. So there's a whole theory that he has given that while author may have a sort of a important position, but don't make him God, because there are many contexts where author may not have written his own name. He may be hesitant. For example, we have in our Sufi tradition, Rumi and Shams, Kulliyat Shams Tabriz, although people thought it's by Shams, but it's by Rumi, who says that he attributes the whole divan to Shams Tabriz, although he is himself writing, assumption being that he had lost his own identity. In everything that he was nothing but his master, that is Shams. So he writes in Shams. So do we take it as Shams's, or do we take it as Rumi? And sometimes there are multiple attributions of the same work. There's a very famous Ginan in Khoja tradition, in Ginan tradition, called Sakhi Maapad Ke Riwat. And we see it that it is attributed to Pir Sadardi. But during my research, I came across a book by Qayamuddin Chishti, Noor-e Roshan. It's a Gujarati poem, and there are some Si Harfi's acrostic poems by Chishti. In that, there is one poem exactly Sakhi Maapad ke rivat koi jaan. And I was again wondering that this is supposed to be by Pir Sadardin. And how does Qayamuddin Chishti claims it that he wrote it? But to my surprise, the editor puts a footnote there. Okay, this poem is by Qayamuddin Chishti, but by mistake, ઘણા લોકો ભૂલમાં તેને કબીરનું સમજે છે. Many people think that it is by Kabir. Now, there's no Pir Sadruddin there. And there's one article I read that will real Kabir raise his hand, please? Because so many texts are attributed to Kabir. In fact, there are some acrostics that are attributed to Kabir, which are considered very old. So we are talking of a time where there was no copyright notion. There was no notion of copyright. Everybody could use whatever they liked. The plagiarism is a modern concept. Copyright is also a modern concept. And imagine the fate of authors in AI world that we are entering, where perhaps author is dead even before he writes, because now the machine generate the text. So machines are the authors. So what will happen to the author? So I'm not underplaying the significance of the author, but in our tradition, in modern times, the notion of author that we have and the notion of author in the medieval time was quite different. In our times, as Professor Hawley of Columbia University writes, he says that, you want to write your name every time, take ownership of it. In American culture, it says we write the name of the author first. But if you go to India, more than author, the title is more important. And he put forth one very interesting approach that distinguishes the author and authority. Very beautifully presented, this whole notion that how we should see the issue of authorship when it comes to the medieval literature. Professor Ali Asani develops this idea further, and he writes, from a scholarly point of view, perhaps the more fruitful question we may need to ask regarding these literatures should focus on their contextual and functional relationship with their communities. Ultimately, texts are sacred only when a religious community is able to discover religious meaning and truth within them. So what is happening here is that while author is important, text is also important, but text is nothing unless the reader really reads it and reader owns it, interprets it and absorbs it, and it gives meanings, and there could be several meanings that one can find of the same text. So authorship by an important religious personality becomes an important means of legitimizing or validating use of such texts. So we find multiple association, attribution of a text, perhaps this perspective of what is author, but more than author, what is community doing with it, what the reader is doing with it becomes very important. Dr. Ismail concurs with the view, above view, and he says it's a step in the right direction. So text and reader are also important part of that triangle that I showed, two angles. Very interesting perspective given by Gadamer on literary criticism. He says, when you deal with the text, there are two horizons actually. One horizon is presented by the author through the text, whether author is there or not, known or not unknown. But of course, some author is speaking through the text. So that's one horizon. And then the reader comes with his own horizon, with his own understanding, his or her own engagement with the text. And then these two horizons meet, they infuse, so they melt. The meaning gets created when these two horizons melt or meet or infuse, and that is very important. So reader is continuing author also. Reader is the one who determines the meaning of the text. Reader is the one who really establishes the significance. Now, reader could be individual, reader could be as a whole community, and it's a very dynamic process. I'll just give you quickly one little story from our tradition. We hear from seniors that there is a Ginan Samiraju More Manthin. I'm not 100% sure of the authenticity of it, but it really conveys this message so beautifully. That is said that one spiritualist like Kala Ruda took by Ginan, Swami Raju More Manthina Visare, and he had several interpretations of that. And he, because Imam has always encouraged that don't read Ginans like newspaper, teni hajaro maina thai છે. So try to deconstruct meaning, deeper meanings of it. It's a different topic, but Kala Ruda is supposed to have presented this interpretation, his interpretations, more than 10, some say 5, 4, whatever be the number. But Imam was happy that somebody has really, no, it's very difficult in our times to get one meaning because the text is so far removed from our culture or our knowledge. So Imam appreciated, commended his effort, and it is said that Imam said, these are all good, very good, and but there's this, out of all these meanings that you've given, it has nothing which the composer had in mind. Now this is the richness of the text. This is the richness of any literary piece, and it's not only true here. We know several poets who have written poem with one meaning, and reader may come out with several other deeper interpretations, which may be news for even the composer. And that's the whole dynamic process of engaging with the text. But there are some cautions that we need to that we don't overread, we don't get into anachronism, that we read something which was inconceivable in the times and when it was written. So these are some important parts. Now, Ramanujan studied a lot of Tamil poetry, and he gives very interesting insight onto what is actually happening in this type of literature. He says, in the transition process, it is likely that literature goes consciously or unconsciously several gradual variation, linguistic simplification or otherwise, though its essential structure may remain intact. Now, what is happening is saying that there are two traditions. There's no impenetrable wall there. There is a membrane through which the flow is possible. So from one, just as from Yārī to Aḥmed Shāh or Aḥmed Shāh to Yārī, we have the text interflow. Now, he says it's difficult to isolate elements as belonging exclusively to one or the other. So there's always this osmosis happening between two traditions, because there's a membrane there, and that membrane is porous. It's not something that is rigid or close to other traditions. Sila Khan gives an interesting insight. She says, Ginan must have undergone series of gradual transformation that renders meaningless the very concept of original text. Now, sometimes we say, no, this is original, that is not original. We don't have the videos or the original text of all the Ginans. Sila Khan says that they may have gone through, and it is evident from a lot of study of printed or many manuscript editions that words do vary. This does not mean, very important, however, that the sacred character of this literature has not ensured to a great extent its continuity and homogeneity. So there's a lot of evolution possible. Why do these traditions interflow? How do they happen? Dr. Ismail gives an interesting insight. He says in their existential reference, although in another context he says this, that then in existential reference, they share a deep structure in common. Professor Shaigan, he used to teach at the IIS when we were studying, late Professor Shaigan. He would always say that, the religions have two dimensions, outer and inner. If you take the outer, the exoteric dimension, they will appear differently. But if you take the inner part, they are sharing common constellation. They are at same wavelength. And he takes the example, his study was on Majmul Bahrain, a very important work by Dara Shikoh, where he compares the Hinduism and Islamic concepts and tries to show the unity underneath the diversity of two traditions. Very powerful quote. It says, various religions at their esoteric plane are, despite the considerable differences between them, the same wavelength. They are sharing the same wavelength in the same constellation, as it were, which gravitates round an invisible center and which is man's spiritual homeland. In other words, we discern here the structural homogeneity of metaphysical experiences. since they draw their inspiration from one and the same source of original experience, they permit the passage of symbol from one culture to another. So although superficially he used to give an example that if you take a mullah and a purohit, oftentimes they may not get along well. But if you take Sufi and a saint, they will understand each other because they are at the inner plane of their respective religions. Of course, we need to, when we study text, we have to study on their own terms, not to trust the present notion. Otherwise, we land into an anachronistic issue. Si Harfi, now what is the summary points here? Si Harfi is, of course, a very deep mystical poem. The similarity with Alif Nama, one can see that there was no copyright laws then, or it was not the notion there. So there, everybody knowledge belonged to one, the ultimate, and everybody partook of it. So that was the culture in which various texts came about. The texts are author's subjective experience. Of course, when author is writing, it's his or her subjective experience. Yet often, in the case of Ginan or in the case of community literature, they wrote with a larger purpose of community, and they were representing an authority. Finally, this is what I think, and this is, I say, it's a working conclusion, that for a living community with a living imam, any text from shared heritage or otherwise, it may be within the tradition or it may have been a tradition, part of the shared heritage. If it is conveying the essence of the tariqah and it is approved for the time, it becomes part of that, what Meera used the term wonderful tradition referred to by Imam in relation to the Ginan or the large devotional literature. Now, that's the community perspective, seeing from the inside. But there's no contradiction with the academic study because Imam encourages the whole institute is for that. So the application of academic standards can help enrich the understanding of evolving nature of the tradition itself. So we don't carpet those texts, but in my study, I have compared the current text with a few of the printed and also the manuscript tradition, and also this Alif Nāmā by Yārī, and given the variations that where the words are different. And it gives you some enrichment that, yes, how this terminologies are used. Now, they all literature serve as both product, because they are subjective expressions of the composers. So that's a product. But then that becomes a starting point for us, for one who engages with the text, and they become the source for spiritual inspiration. And this urge is that we should be able to, inshallah, continue to derive that spiritual inspiration. And I'm very thankful to this platform to have given this opportunity, and to all of you who are participating. And let's continue with the journey. And we could take question answers if there are any, or any comments, suggestions, observations. I really thank so many people with whom I've studied, so many senior wise and my mentors, and they all have, I'm not naming any, but this text has fascinated several people. Many wise in have had their effort to deconstruct this text, and have benefited from whatever I've heard. Of course, I take responsibility for whatever I'm saying. Now, this part, you may not be at home so much familiar about authority and this whole literary criticism part, but inshallah, in the second session, where we'll actually deal with the text, I hope you'll feel more at home. Yes, Meera, so if there are any observations, comments, criticism, suggestions, they're welcome.
Thank you so much, Alif Keshwani, for such an in-depth and illuminating talk on Si Harfi. Just to kind of briefly summarize, it was so fascinating to hear that this form of poetry, an acrostic, was prevalent among the other South Asian traditions, because you mentioned Si Harfi being popularized in Farsi, Pashto, Urdu, Punjabi, and Sindhi. And I was tempted to think that this form of poetry was part of the Central Asian tradition. since you mentioned Farsi, but then I realized that it's possibly not Central Asian, since Farsi was the court language of since Mughal times, and in the Indian subcontinent, and so would fall under the South Asian tradition rather than the Central Asian tradition. But correct me if I'm wrong, Pyarali sir.
As I said, I
also
think, yeah, continue, please. Yeah.
No, sorry, go ahead.
No,
Do you think it is South Asian?
You're right. See, languages are sometimes related to cultures and places, but say, Urdu, especially Farsi, there's a lot of Farsi literature in South Asia also, until the Mughal time, even
Absolutely.
later. So, although Farsi gets localized in Iran or in Central Asia, India had a large play to contribute in the development of Farsi literature. So we have specimen acrostics in all sorts of languages, all lands and languages.
Thank you. You also talk about the symbolism of letters and its mystical meaning. The Quran has it. You mentioned Anne-Marie Schimmel talking of understanding the secret of letters only through vision and the aid of divine intervention. You also mentioned the significance of the Nukta and the which is also mentioned in this Si Harfi. And I was thinking as to the importance placed by religious traditions on these secret and sacred words, letters and words. It's interesting how much importance different religious traditions have given to these secret letters and sacred letters. Your discovery journey of Alif Nama is as interesting as your comparison of the two texts of Si Harfi and Alif Nama, and you conclude that it is not possible to settle the issue of authorship unless more material comes to light.
Sure.
Moreover, you bring valuable component of literary criticism in understanding the issue of authorship. You mentioned Professor Ali Asani, and that according to him, more fruitful questions with regards to these literature would be to focus on their contextual and functional relationship with their communities, and that texts are sacred only when religious community is able to discover religious meaning and truth within them. And authorship by an important religious personality becomes an important means of legitimizing and validating the use of such texts. I'm quoting from what you've mentioned. And this is so true because these granths and ginans have deep religious meaning for the community. And historically, we see that there has been a seamless transition of literary traditions. And you mentioned Ramanujan talking of the interflow of traditions and that there is permeable membrane between traditions. Interesting words. Therefore, they flow into one another. And so it is difficult to isolate these elements as belonging to one or the other, as you mentioned. And I was thinking about this as to why is this the case? Why have different traditions taken so seamlessly from one another? And immediately in the next slide, I see that you mentioned about why do traditions interflow? And once again, you quote Aziz Ismail, who in his book, The Poetics of Religious Experience, writes that in their existential reference, they share a deep structure in common. Similarly, you also mentioned the Ryu Shagan as saying various religions in their esoteric plane share the same wavelength, a structural homogeneity of metaphysical experience, since they draw their inspiration from one and the same source of original experience. You know, this also reminds me of the last ASG keynote address by Professor Karim H. Karim in his talk, Are Ginans Hindu or Islamic, where he talks about how peers effortlessly weave through various symbols and epics and forms of Hindustani music from the prevalent culture in their ginans and granths, and their vocabulary embodies not just the Shia Ismaili concepts, but also speaks through the Sufi and the Bhakti devotional modes. And I think you have beautifully shown that all these authors who speak of the interflow of traditions or the various religious traditions in their esoteric plane, sharing the same wavelength, with Karim H. Karim talking about the human quest for the divine truth, that is integrative of traditions and worldviews. All of you acknowledge that these great poetic literature was in service of the quest for a higher truth, various religious traditions. And you very rightly conclude that Si Harfi is a mystical granth and has resonance with shared traditions and texts, and that interchange between traditions was a common phenomena. And there was no strict copyrights, and that authors wrote for serving larger purpose of a community, representing an authority, of course. And so, I mean, this was amazing. Thank you so much for such an important educational talk and bringing to light this critical piece of research on Si Harfi. We will now have a brief question and answer session, and I would like to request all of you to write your questions in the chat box, please, to me. Let me just see if there are any questions. I have one question which was written. Are our holy Ginans extension of Holy Quran or interpretations in Indian languages by our peers?
Well, traditionally we have understood Ginan as a commentary or an interpretation of the Holy Scripture, the Quran. Quran is Quran, right? Just as we have this Masnavi by Rumi, that's considered Quran in Farsi. It has, now that doesn't mean it replaces the Quran, but the message of the Quran is integrated in that literature, and people who were not, of course, in Iranian context they would be knowledgeable, but in Indian context the knowledge of Arabic was very rare, and the community did not have that engagement directly, by and large. One cannot generalize. So what served the vehicle to understand the Quran was Ginan. So Ginan, where an interpretation or in some farmans, Imam Sultan Shah explains that these Ginans convey the tafsir of the Quran, the meaning of the Quran. But of course, when you see, basically it's the text and the engagement of the community or engagement of the reader. Now reader decides what that text is going to mean to him. Now Ginan served that important source to access Quran. Those who did not have access to Arabic language, so it became, and it still continues to be that vehicle.
Thank you, Pyarali sir. I have another question which was actually sent to me by our own chairman. I'm just going to read out to you. There is in one of the, I'm just going to read out Si Harfi, some part of Si Harfi, and he's asked, I would want you to throw some light on that. So this is in Gujarati, and I'm just going to read it out. Ohang Niranjan ek vraksha kita, ek Nur Muhammad Mustafa, Mai Fatima bi unke bhele, aisa ohang ape samrat, Satguru Sahib ka sharana lije. And so there is this line about Nur of Muhammad and Nur of Ali. What is this concept? Can you elaborate on that?
This is a very interesting question, and brief answer I would give is chunk of our second talk is going to be based on that, because it's part of the opening part of Si Harfi. Oham Niranjan ek Rushaj Kita, unko Dali doje dita. Ek Nur Nabi Muhammad Mustafa, Duja Nur Ali Murtaza. So it's basically a whole description of cosmology, how this composer sees cosmos, how this world got created, rather this whole universe got created. So the notion is that Brahman created a word that is Ohang. I'm resisting to go into detail of it, because the next session is on cosmology to start with. But the author, normally composer, would start with placing the cosmological understanding of it. It is not a scientific understanding of cosmos, but it's a faith context, where here Ahmed Shah says that God or the Brahman created Ohang, as we see in the Quranic context, that Allah creates when he wants to create anything, he says kun. So Ohang is very similar to it's a divine imperative or divine command, kun. So Ohang Niranjan ek vruksh kita, he created that vruksh meaning trees. This is a whole symbolism, tree symbolism. Unku dali do jo dita, there are two branches to it. Ek Nur Muhammad Mustafa, Duja Nur Ali Murtada. So on one there is Prophet Muhammad and the other is Hazrat Ali. So they are the branches of the same tree, Ana wa Ali min Nurin wa. So basically the Shia notion of Ali and Nabi are from the same Nur. So belonging to the same tree. Now what happens? Ek Mai Fatima bhi unke bhele, Hasan us Nur Mai kele. The whole notion of Panchatan Pak. So all five entities are there. Aisa Ohang Ape Samrat. This Ohang or this divine imperative is Samrat meaning very powerful. Ape Samrat on its own it is very powerful. And then in the same part, subsequently, Ahmed Shah says that Ohang creates Ohankar. That is the mystical word that is given. So Ohankar apar bhaj, you now engage into the remembrance of it. Ohang apas ko sabat kijiye. You establish or realize that Ohang, that creative command or divine imperative within yourself. Sadhguru Sahib ka sharana lijiye. Ohang apas ko sabat kijiye. You take the refuge under the true master, Sadhguru, because Sadhguru is the manifestation of that word. As we say, Ulil Amra, right? The possessor of that command. So there's a lot of parallel between the pre-Ginan philosophy. And again, this will dwell more into it. There's no question that, say, for example, Sijistani talks about this, and here Ahmed Shah talks about it. There's no question of contact or borrowing from each other. But as Dr. Ismail says, no, you move from Sijistani to Ginan, it might look very incongruous because they lived in very different time zone. They lived in very different land, culture, social. But still, there's some parallelism because they have a common existential reference, right? And therefore, we see some. I would rather reserve this for the next session. But thank you for that question. It's very important.
Thank you. I have one last question. Okay, there's two other questions have come in, but one question is, can you talk about the first reading of a text and subsequent ones? Also, the reader's change of understanding when reading the text at a later stage.
Yeah, that's the whole natural process. We read text at different times in our age, in our life, and we ourselves find different meanings. So that's the dynamic process, engaging of the reader with the text. And as I tried to illustrate through that example of Kala Ruda, is that everybody engages with the text and may find one's own meaning, which is dynamic, which can change depending on what is your grasp. And sometimes you may even find deeper meaning than what the original poet may have intended, which is fine, because poet would have written in a context. And like, for example, this I was reading about this Road Less Traveled, David Frost, that poem. And there are some debates on that what did he mean by that? And he was alive to clarify that I didn't mean that. I just wrote it as some remark to my friend. But it has taken its own life, and which is interesting. Absolutely. So insofar it doesn't become anachronistic, engaging with the reader, and that's the melting of horizons. The author comes with one horizon, but the reader comes with another. And when they meet, it really gives you that joy. It takes you, it uplifts. And that's why this text and engagement with the text is very significant.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alvas Pyarali Keshwani. I'm afraid I'm going to have to call it a day because we have run out of time. On behalf of the Association for the Study of Ginans, let me take this opportunity to say a heartfelt thank you to you, Alvas Pyarali Keshwani, for such a stimulating and insightful talk. I have learned so much from your talk and enjoyed listening to you, and I think so have all. My special thanks to our IT and design team, Altaf, Alina, and Islam Shah, one of our board members and governors, and to our chairman, Shiraz Pradhan, who's been working behind the scenes. Finally, many thanks to all of you, the audience who have joined us from across the world. Thank you for joining us on Ginan Insights. Please be on the lookout for our future Ginan Insights talks on Facebook and also our webinar recording on our ASU YouTube channel. Thank you all and have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening. Yāli Madad.